Hi, I'm Doug Horchak, and you're listening to Verse by Verse. Today we're going to read and comment on words from the book of Romans that are a very graphic description by the Apostle Paul of the sexual culture of the Roman Empire in the first century. In the first chapter of this letter Paul wrote to the church at Rome, he begins by commenting on how the Roman society no longer knew or acknowledged the true God. And then we find Paul commenting on the result of that departure from God in their sexual immorality. In Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, we read, "For this reason God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due." Now that's a pretty graphic description of sexual activity and conduct. Yet this lifestyle Paul describes is behavior that many people today in the 21st century would say is okay. Many would say that this is merely an alternative lifestyle that should, and actually is, accepted as normal. But just what is Paul saying here? And what can we glean from this description of an immoral culture that was extant in Rome 2,000 years ago? First, let's acknowledge that first century Rome, which was the capital of the empire, had a culture all its own. Many a history book and Hollywood movies depict a lifestyle among the rich and elite in ancient Rome that was all too common, and it's consistent with what Paul described in verses 26 and 27. We also find Paul addressing the nature of the thinking and mind of individuals that practice and embrace these types of relationships. First of all, in verse 26, Paul uses the word exchanged, describing some women's use of their bodies being contrary to the biology of a female. The Greek word in the original text translated exchange is metalasso, which means to convert in Greek, to change from one state to another. But then Paul contrasts that comment with the natural state in which one is born. He uses the terms by nature or natural. The original Greek word in this text is physis, which means the way one is born, natural at birth. Paul then concludes that this sexual relationship was contrary to their created or natural state, thus describing two women having sexual relations with one another. But then Paul also comments on men, acknowledging that this intimate sexual relationship between two women or between two men was based on lust, and as Paul stated to the church, it was shameful. Stating this behavior is actually obscene, without shame, meaning without morality. So we can conclude that these relationships are not natural, not the way we were made, and certainly from a biblical perspective, not what the Creator God intended or designed. Paul also implies that when engaging in such behavior, over time, something happens. Something changes in that person. In these two verses, we see that the natural God-given expressions of one's emotions and use of their body is exchanged or replaced with something very, very different. A different way of thinking, a different way of seeking pleasure, and a different, and I would say dysfunctional type of relationship. It's worth noting that mankind discovered decades ago that human behavior actually causes changes in the human brain. Such is the case when we develop habits, of which many of us have. Such is also true when people develop behavior addictions. We have seen this play out in very sad and tragic stories of millions of people that have become addicted to substances, to drugs, and even behavior. And while God has great compassion and concern for human beings that have abused their bodies, that have engaged in lifestyles that are destructive and even fatal, He does not eliminate the results of such choices. Paul ends this comment in Romans chapter 1 and verse 27 by stating that people that practice this lifestyle, as he writes, receive for themselves the penalty of their error which was due, the New King James Version. A few other Bible translations render Paul's words this way. The New Living Translation states, "They suffered within themselves the penalty they deserved." And then the Amplified Bible reads, "In returning, receiving in their own bodies the inevitable and appropriate penalty for their wrongdoing." Now those are very, very sobering words. But this principle, that of reaping what we sow, is really the story of mankind, on so many levels and in so many ways over the last many thousands of years. And like all sin, behavior that is contrary to God's design, His laws, His created order, all sin carries the penalty of the suffering and grief that we humans have been bringing upon ourselves for millennia. But we should note that there is hope. In fact, great hope for all of mankind. The Bible is clear in foretelling a time in the future when God will intervene in human affairs. He and His family will bring an end to the chaos, confusion, and twisted reality that increasingly defines the age we live in. Jesus Christ will return and intervene in human affairs to bring order, to bring peace, and the way to true happiness to this confused and saddened world. As I bring this to an end, let me suggest 2 articles that can be found on our Life, Hope, and Truth website. One entitled, Why Sex Matters, the Architect's Design, and another entitled, Return of Christ, as the Days of Noah Were.
If you've been enjoying Verse by Verse and want to help the show grow, here's what you can do to get the word out. Wherever you're listening, make sure to subscribe. If you're on a platform that accepts reviews and ratings, those can both make a big difference in helping other people find us. Verse by Verse is a Life, Hope, and Truth podcast. Check out the show notes to find more free content, like videos, articles, and booklets in our Learning Center.